Tanya is a single mother in Melbourne. She works full time. She pays her taxes. She does everything the system asks of her. Last month, when her electricity bill arrived, she already knew the numbers wouldn't work. Rent had gone up again. Groceries cost more than the month before. School expenses were due. The electricity bill was the final straw. She sat at her kitchen table and cried. Not because she was weak, because there was nothing left to cut. Tanya's story isn't unusual. In 2026, it's the norm. The average rent in Australia's major cities has reached $2,600 a month. In Sydney, the median weekly house rent is $780. That's $40,560 a year, just for rent. The median full-time salary in Australia is $92,000. After tax, roughly $71,000. Rent alone now consumes 57% of a single income, before food, before transport, before electricity, before the school expenses that broke Tanya. And across the country, people are making a decision that would have been unthinkable 10 years ago. They're leaving. Not leaving their suburb, not leaving their city, leaving Australia. Let's lay out what's happened to rents in Australia. Since 2020, national rents have surged by 42.9%. That's not a gradual increase over a decade. That's nearly half again in 5 years. In dollar terms, it added roughly $204 per week to the median rent, over $10,600 a year in additional cost for the same apartment in the same suburb. Before that, the 5 years prior to 2020, rents rose by just 7.5%, $33 per week. So in the 5 years from 2015 to 2020, rents went up $33. In the 5 years from 2020 to 2025, they went up $204. The acceleration isn't gradual, it's a wall. Australian households are now spending a record 33.4% of their pre-tax income on rent. That's the national average. In Sydney, it's dramatically higher. In some inner city areas, renters spend 40 to 50% of their income just keeping a roof. And the stress threshold, the point where economists say you're in financial danger, is 30%. The average Australian renter is now officially in rental stress. Not some renters, not vulnerable renters, the average renter. Vacancy rates across the country remain below 2%. A healthy market needs 3%. At below 2, landlords hold all the power. They set the price, they pick the tenant, they raise the rent at renewal because they know you have nowhere else to go. In some cities, vacancy is below 1%. That means for every 100 rental properties, fewer than 1 is available. Renters aren't choosing homes, they're competing for them. Bidding wars, offering months of rent in advance, writing letters to landlords pleading for a lease. This is not a housing market. This is a hunger game with a lease agreement. Let's do the math that politicians won't. A household earning the combined median income, roughly $133,000 before tax, takes home approximately $102,000 after tax. That's $8,500 per month. Rent, $2,600. That's 30.6% of take-home pay, already at the stress line. Now add the rest of life. Groceries for a family of 4, roughly $1,200 to $1,500 per month, with Australian groceries now 10 to 15% more expensive than the UK, and beef costing 50% more per kilo. Electricity and gas, $300 to $400 and rising, with energy rebates expiring. Transport, $500 to $700, depending on whether you drive or take public transport. Car insurance, registration, petrol, tolls. Internet and phone, $200. Health insurance, $400 to $500 for a family. Childcare, if you have young children, averages $129 per day before subsidies. Even after subsidies, that's easily $1,000 per month. Add it up. Rent plus basic living costs for a family of 4 in a major Australian city comes to roughly $7,000 to $8,000 per month, out of $8,500 take home. That leaves between $500 and $1,500 per month. For everything else, clothing, school supplies, birthday presents, a single dental visit, one car repair, one unexpected bill. There is no margin, there is no savings, there is no buffer between this family and crisis. And if rent goes up by even $100 at the next renewal, which is common, which is legal, which happens every day, that buffer disappears entirely. A Melbourne warehouse supervisor named Michael described what happened when his rent jumped $480 in a single renewal. We cut holidays, streaming services, everything, but there's nowhere left to cut when rent alone consumes the majority of your income. Michael isn't in poverty. Michael works full-time. Michael is the Australian middle class. Rents don't explode by 43% in 5 years by accident. 3 forces collided simultaneously, and the government let it happen. Force 1, immigration without housing. Australia's population grew by 423,000 people in the year to September 2025. Net overseas migration accounted for 311,000 of those. As of January 2026, there were 2.98 million temporary visa holders in the country, 10% of the total population. Almost all new migrants rent. They need housing the day they arrive. And they all enter the same rental market at the same time. The result? Demand surged. Supply didn't. Vacancy rates collapsed, and landlords raised rents because they could, because there were 20 people lined up for every apartment. Force 2, the COVID snapback. During the pandemic, borders closed. International students left. Inner city apartments emptied. Rents actually fell briefly, in some cases by 20 to 30%. Some landlords offered months free just to keep tenants. Then the borders reopened. All at once, a tidal wave of students, workers, and migrants flooded back into a market that had barely built anything in 2 years. Rents didn't just recover, they rocketed past pre-COVID levels within months. Force 3, investor withdrawal. Rising interest rates hit landlords hard. Many who'd bought investment properties with cheap pandemic-era loans suddenly faced much higher repayments. Some sold. The number of rental properties in some markets actually shrank while demand grew. And the ones who stayed? They passed the cost on. Higher interest rates became higher rents. Not some of the increase, all of it. As one CBA economist noted, the relationship is simple. When population growth outpaces housing supply, rents rise. And in Australia, population growth has outpaced supply every single year since the pandemic, and is projected to keep doing so until at least 2029. At below 2% vacancy, the power dynamic between tenants and landlords has completely inverted. Tenants don't negotiate, they beg. They write cover letters for apartments. They offer 6 months rent up front. They compete against dozens of other applicants, some offering above the asking rent just to secure the lease. And for migrants, the system is even crueler. A writer for the Lowy Institute, one of Australia's most respected foreign policy think tanks, described arriving in Melbourne with postgraduate degrees, international work experience, and legal working rights. None of it mattered. Landlords wanted Australian credit history, stable local employment, and months of rent in advance. Without those, they were invisible. The article described Australia's rental market as not just expensive, it's exclusionary, a system that functions as a gatekeeper, keeping out anyone who doesn't fit a narrow financial profile. And for international students, one of the groups Australia most actively recruits, the conditions are devastating. Rental inflation in Australia is now 8 times higher than it was in the late 2010s. Median rents in Melbourne and Sydney jumped by more than 30% in just 2 years. And the bidding wars are creating a secondary crisis. When 20 people compete for one apartment, the person who wins is the person who can pay the most. Every time that happens, the new rental rate becomes the benchmark. The next landlord lists higher. The next tenant pays more. the floor keeps rising. Only 2% of private rentals in Australia are affordable for a single person on the minimum wage. 2% in the entire country. If you earn the legal minimum and you want to live alone, there are almost no options anywhere in Australia. Rental stress isn't a risk anymore, it's the default. This is the part of the story that the government doesn't want told because it reveals the ultimate consequence of a rental market that breaks people. They leave. 53% of Australians aged 18 to 35 say they would consider leaving the country for more affordable housing. 16% say they definitely would. They're not bluffing. Social scientists are documenting a growing stream of Australians researching housing and employment opportunities in Southeast Asia, Europe, and New Zealand. Not as a gap year, as an escape plan. The destinations are specific: Bali and Thailand for cheap living and remote work, Portugal for European appeal and digital nomad visas, Dubai for zero income tax and employment packages that include housing. These aren't wealthy expats seeking adventure. These are young professionals, teachers, nurses, and tradespeople who've calculated that the Australian dream costs less overseas than it does in Australia. Sydney has experienced its largest domestic outmigration in over 20 years. People in their 30s, the age group that should be settling down, buying homes, raising children, are the most common demographic leaving. They're heading to regional areas, interstate, or out of the country entirely. And Canada, the one country that shared Australia's exact rental crisis, showed what happens when a government takes demand-side action. After implementing significant cuts to temporary and permanent migration in 2024, Canada's average asking rents fell for 17 consecutive months. The typical Canadian tenant is now paying $172 less per month. Rental affordability improved from 34% of income to 29%, below the stress threshold. Australia saw the same evidence, the same data, the same proof that reducing demand reduces rents, and chose to do nothing. Australia's net overseas migration remains the highest in the English-speaking world. Per capita, it dwarfs the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada combined. The government knows this drives rents higher. They've been told repeatedly by their own economic agencies, by the National Housing Supply and Affordability Council, by the Reserve Bank. They keep the tax on because migrants pay taxes and inflate GDP. The rent they pay and the lives they destroy in the process aren't counted in the growth figures. Behind the percentages and policy debates, there are 3.2 million Australians who are one rent increase away from losing their home, one paycheck, one car breakdown, one medical emergency. 64% of women under 40 are very concerned about the cost of living. That's the highest anxiety level of any demographic group in the country. 3 in 10 Australians under 40 have some level of concern about becoming homeless within the next 12 months. Not about money, about homelessness, in one of the richest countries on earth. And the ripple effects go far beyond housing. Parents are cutting food budgets, not luxuries, nutrition. Community organisations and food banks report that hunger is no longer a hidden issue in Australia. 30% of households nationally experience food insecurity. 20% regularly skip meals or go entire days without eating. 21% of young Australians have delayed having children because of housing costs, not because they don't want kids, because they can't afford the second bedroom. Medical care gets postponed, dental visits skipped. Mental health support, already stretched to breaking, becomes inaccessible when the copay is one bill too many. The economic cycle feeds itself. When households spend 40, 50, 60% of income on rent, that money doesn't flow through the local economy. Cafes lose customers, retail stores close, hairdressers, gyms, restaurants, they all depend on discretionary spending from the same people who no longer have discretionary income. Entire suburbs are hollowing out economically. The people are still there, working, commuting, surviving, but they've stopped spending because the rent took everything. One financial analyst described it as a self reinforcing cycle where the economy weakens as households tighten their belts, which in turn reduces income growth, which makes the rents even harder to afford. The rental crisis isn't a housing problem, it's an economic black hole that sucks in everything around it: health, nutrition, family formation, consumer spending, local business, mental well-being, and spits out nothing but profit for landlords and tax revenue for governments. Canada did it. They cut migration. Rents fell for 17 consecutive months. Affordability improved by 5 percentage points in a single year. Australia could do the same, but it chooses not to. Beyond migration settings, the solutions have been on the table for years. Increase Commonwealth rent assistance by at least 60%. The current payments lag so far behind actual rents that they're absorbed before they reach anyone's pocket. Mission Australia has begged for this, repeatedly. Build social housing at scale. 1 in every 10 new homes should be social or affordable housing, not as charity, as infrastructure, the way roads and hospitals are built, because the market alone can't serve everyone. Implement rent stabilisation, not rent freezing, stabilisation. Cap the annual increase at a percentage tied to wages, not to market demand. Several European countries do this. It doesn't destroy the market, it prevents the market from destroying tenants. Reform the tax system. End negative gearing for new purchases. Halve the capital gains discount. Every dollar of tax break that goes to a property investor is a dollar that inflates rents for the person living in the next apartment. And match immigration intake to housing construction capacity, not to some abstract economic target, to the actual physical number of homes that exist. Every one of these measures would reduce rents. Every one is backed by evidence. Everyone has been recommended by economists, housing researchers, and frontline service organisations. And everyone threatens the interests of landlords, property investors, and the federal budget, which is why none of them have been implemented. There's a dimension to this crisis that Australians rarely discuss, but the rest of the world can see clearly. Australia markets itself as one of the most beautiful, livable, inclusive countries on earth. It spends billions recruiting international students. It advertises to skilled workers across Asia, Europe, and the Middle East. Come to Australia, build a life. And then those people arrive, qualified, motivated, legally permitted to work, and discover they can't rent an apartment. The Lowy Institute described it as a reputational risk. When the country you were recruited to live in treats you as a financial liability at the doorstep of a real estate agent, the brand takes a hit. International students, who generate over $40 billion a year for the Australian economy, occupy roughly 7% of rental stock. Yet they were blamed in the lead up to the last election for causing the housing crisis. The people who generate the least demand get the most blame. The policies that generate the most demand get no scrutiny. And the country's reputation as a fair, inclusive society erodes every time a qualified migrant writes a pleading cover letter for a one-bedroom apartment and gets rejected because they don't have an Australian credit score. This isn't just a domestic crisis, it's an international embarrassment for a country that built its modern identity on welcoming people from everywhere. Let's go back to Tanya, the single mother in Melbourne, sitting at her kitchen table, crying over an electricity bill. Tanya works full-time. She's not unemployed. She's not reckless. She's not making bad decisions. She's a single parent in a country where rent takes $2,600 a month, groceries cost 50% more than they should, energy bills keep climbing, and the government's answer is a one-off rebate that gets absorbed before it arrives. There are millions of Tanyas. Warehouse supervisors cutting holidays and streaming services and everything else until there's nothing left to cut. Families of four doing the math every Sunday night and arriving at the same answer: not enough. $2,600 a month. That number is not a statistical abstraction. It's the point at which a country starts losing its own people. Not to war, not to famine, to a rental market that extracts more than a human being can sustain. 53% of young Australians have considered leaving. The ones who stay aren't staying because they're thriving, they're staying because they can't afford the plane ticket. Australia is one of the most naturally wealthy countries on the planet. Mineral resources, agricultural land, coastline, climate. It has every advantage that geography can provide. And it's pricing out the nurses who staff its hospitals, the teachers who run its schools, the tradies who build its buildings, the young families who would become its next generation of taxpayers and voters and citizens. $2,600 a month and climbing. That's not a housing market, that's a country eating itself. And the people it's swallowing are the ones who keep it alive. If you made it to the end, this one matters. Subscribe, because this series isn't slowing down. Next video, I'm going deep on the country that gave the richest 1% a $12 billion tax break while 250,000 families wait for a home that will never come. Share this video with every renter you know, not because it will fix anything, but because people need to know the system isn't broken. It's built this way. Comments are open. Tell me what rent is doing to your life. I read every single one.